maximum alert, an attack in the Caribbean, and the pieces of the international chessboard begin to fall. Imagine the scene. It's 4 o'clock in the morning in Washington when the red phone rings in the White House crisis room. On the other end of the line, generals inform that an American base in the Caribbean has been attacked. Missiles fired from Venezuelan territory hit hangars, runways, and fuel depots. Explosions were seen miles away. Soldiers run amidst the chaos, and the world's greatest military power wakes up to a nightmare that once seemed impossible. Now think with me. What would happen if Venezuela, in a bold and desperate act, really attacked an American military installation so close to its territory? How would Washington react? What would the regional allies do? And perhaps the most important question, could this be the spark of a war of global proportions? We're not talking about a Hollywood script, but a realistic simulation based on actual facts, historical tensions, and existing military capabilities. What you're about to hear is the unfolding of a conflict that, although improbable, is within the realm of possibility. The relationship between the United States and Venezuela has never been simple. For much of the 20th century, Venezuela was considered one of Washington's main allies in Latin America. The country was a stable democracy, rich in oil, and its elites maintained close ties with the U.S.-American companies exploited Venezuelan oil fields, while Caracas guaranteed a steady supply of energy to the United States. This honeymoon lasted decades across different administrations, consolidating a partnership that seemed unbreakable. Exxon and Chevron executives freely roamed the halls of power in Caracas, while Venezuelan diplomats were honored guests in Washington. Cultural exchange flourished, with American universities receiving Venezuelan students from wealthy families, creating bonds that felt eternal. But in the late 1990s, with the rise of Hugo Chavez, everything changed. Oil was no longer just an economic link, but became a political weapon. Chavez was not just a rebellious soldier who reached power. He was a visionary with a clear agenda: to turn Venezuela into a leader of the anti-American movement in Latin America. He brought Caracas closer to Moscow, Beijing, and even Tehran, turning Venezuela into a voice opposing U.S. hegemony in the hemisphere. His first moves were symbolic but decisive, rewriting the constitution, nationalizing foreign companies, and strengthening ties with controversial leaders such as Fidel Castro and Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Chavez's rhetoric echoed beyond Venezuelan borders. At the UN, he called the American president the devil. In international forums, he openly criticized Yankee imperialism. But it wasn't just talk. His actions backed his words. Military agreements with Russia brought Sukhoi fighters and S-300 anti-air systems to Venezuelan soil. Cuba became its closest ally in the region, forming a resistance axis that deeply worried American strategists. Cuban advisors began working in Venezuelan ministries, while Cuban doctors flooded Caracas's slums in exchange for cheap oil. Washington responded with growing distrust and progressive sanctions, at first selectively targeting individuals in the Venezuelan government, then increasingly harsher, hitting entire sectors of the economy. The American financial system began treating Venezuelan transactions with extreme caution. U.S. companies were banned from doing business with state-owned enterprises. Assets were frozen. The Venezuelan economy, highly dependent on oil revenues and imports, collapsed. International banks canceled credit lines. U.S. refineries stopped processing Venezuelan oil, and insurance companies withdrew from the country. For Caracas, this became fuel for a narrative of resistance against American imperialism. Each new sanction was framed as proof that the United States wanted to dominate Venezuela and steal its natural wealth. Official discourse turned economic hardship into symbols of national heroism. Food lines became proof of resistance against foreign aggression. Power blackouts were blamed on American sabotage. Hyperinflation was presented as the result of economic warfare orchestrated from Washington. To protect itself militarily, Venezuela invested heavily in weaponry. Russian Su-30 fighters patrolled its skies. Pechora and Buk anti-aircraft systems were deployed at strategic points. Yakan coastal missiles, capable of striking ships over 300 kilometers away, guarded the shoreline. Persistent rumors even suggested the installation of medium-range ballistic missiles, discreetly supplied by Russian or Iranian allies. Underground depots in Venezuelan mountains supposedly stored arsenals capable of striking targets across the Caribbean. Military cooperation with Moscow intensified dramatically. Russian naval bases were established in Venezuela. Tu-160 strategic bombers conducted regular flights over the Caribbean, demonstrating presence and capability. Russian nuclear submarines frequented Venezuelan ports. Joint exercises simulated defense against American amphibious invasions. Tehran also contributed, sending drones, electronic warfare systems, and military advisors specialized in asymmetric tactics. Iranian engineers secretly worked on bunker and underground base construction. This historical and political backdrop helps us understand why the hypothesis of an attack, extreme as it may seem, is not entirely far-fetched. Venezuela turned itself into a fortress state, surrounded by enemies and prepared to resist. Its arsenal, although inferior to America's, had the potential to inflict significant damage. More importantly, its government fostered a siege mentality that could justify desperate measures. Venezuelan leaders began seeing the world through paranoid lenses, interpreting any American military movement as preparation for invasion. Now imagine the specific scenario that could trigger such a crisis. Amidst devastating new sanctions that virtually cut Venezuela off from the global financial system, American naval exercises draw dangerously close to its coast. Carriers, destroyers, and nuclear submarines maneuver in patterns Caracas interprets as invasion rehearsals. At the same time, Colombia authorizes new U.S. bases near the Venezuelan border. Brazil, pressured by Washington, increases patrols in the Amazon. Caribbean nations receive American military equipment under the pretext of fighting drug trafficking. For the Venezuelan government, these movements represent the final encirclement. Emergency meetings at the Miraflores Palace decide that Venezuela cannot wait for the first strike. The strategy is simple but risky: a preemptive attack to demonstrate military capability and force the U.S. to back down. The chosen target is a U.S. airbase on a Caribbean island, close enough to strike, symbolic enough to send an unmistakable message. Generals argue that only by showing readiness to fight could Venezuela force negotiations and prevent total invasion. From secret mountain bases, missile launchers are quietly prepared. Russian-supplied Iskander systems are mounted on mobile platforms. Yakan missiles are repositioned for ground attack. Iranian Shahed drones are armed with explosives, programmed to coordinate with the ballistic missiles. Venezuelan soldiers, trained by Russian and Iranian instructors, execute rehearsed procedures. Then, in the early hours of a calm Tuesday morning, at 4:15 local time, the missiles launch. 12 Iskanders streak toward the base at hypersonic speed, 6 Yakans fly low to evade radar, and 20 Shahed drones swarm in minutes later. Explosions light up the night sky, hangars burn. 8 F-35 fighters worth billions are reduced to rubble. Towers, runways, fuel tanks, all destroyed. The U.S. military, caught off guard, suffers its most shocking blow in decades. And as Washington wakes up to this nightmare, the world changes forever. Now I ask you, do you believe a scenario like this could actually happen? Which factor would be the most decisive? The Venezuelan strike or the inevitable American retaliation? How should countries like Brazil position themselves in such a crisis? History shows us that sometimes a single spark is enough to set the whole world on fire. If you've stayed with us until now, share your opinion. What struck you most in this analysis? Your perspective enriches this debate on the complexities of modern geopolitics.